we'll hear more about it in residency. So my sense is residency versus citizenship. Maybe a happy medium at the end of the day is a program that has a combination of both. That at the end of the day is a mix and match. It's a regime that basically looks at people investing, long-term investment, and benefiting from a fair and equitable tax arrangement. But the one thing that I can't sort of allow myself to agree to is any argument that this region should not be involved in this industry and should not be in this space. And any argument that this region is not sophisticated enough and as a result should relegate itself to where it is or where it's supposed to be. A bunch of backward islands and countries in the region that should not look at a sophisticated mechanism by which to bring in revenue, by which to basically make itself more competitive. And I close with those comments.
Thank you, Anton. That was a fantastic scene set looking at the issue from the Caribbean perspective. And I hope over the next couple of presentations we can also now address looking at some of the future challenges coming from the global regulatory space. And up until now, I think we've been, or contests have largely focused on the interests of the markets where people who are getting citizenship by investment are seeking to get into, so the visa access and the reforms there. But there are increasingly issues coming from the other end, which is the source market of the people who are coming for citizenship by investment. And I think our next speaker is going to talk a bit about that amongst other things in terms of the future challenges and the international headwinds that citizenship by investment schemes are facing at the G20 and elsewhere. So our next speaker is Bruce Zagaris, who's a partner at Washington firm of Berliner, Corker and Monroe. Mr. Zagaris' practice includes international business and tax controversy work, including representing individuals and entities in offshore voluntary disclosure applications, audits and criminal tax investigations, including exchange of information and evidence gathering. His work has included negotiating tax treaties, looking at economic residency programs, advice on FATCA, bilateral investment treaties, mutual assistance in criminal matters treaties, financial regulatory compliance, and proposing and drafting financial products to attract investment. Look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much, Bruce.
Good morning, everyone. Well, in the early 1990s, I was a consultant for the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force on this issue. And I was supposed to present an objective paper. And then afterwards, I saw that all of the G7 countries that were in attendance were very agitated. This was in the days when the Belize program was strong, and Grenada, Dominica had a program. And we've come a long way since then, but a lot of the same issues exist. So let me first look at, just supplement a couple of things that Anton said. First, the benefits, in addition to the revenue, we see that some countries are able to use the program to target niche investments. So for instance, Antigua is doing Hollywood movies. Other countries are targeting other types of investment without the capital from these programs they wouldn't be able to do. We also look at the market for these programs. On the one hand, it's all the areas of the world that are having security problems. The one area that I see a lot of people needing the program are people who have tax issues. They may be high net worth individuals that want to have a certain tax domicile. So we see that certain countries like the UK are changing their tax domiciliary rules. Or we see my country, the US, which taxes on a worldwide basis. And I have a lot of clients who haven't been in the US for 50 years. Maybe they were only here for 3 weeks, but because they have this passport, they suddenly have to pay millions of dollars and make an offshore voluntary disclosure. So immediately they say, this has been a holdup, I want to expatriate. Now, most of them already have other citizenship, but then some of my US clients that only have US citizenship, they want to expatriate and they need other citizenship. Now, this assumes that they've met both the tax and the immigration aspects of the US anti-expatriation law, which is another subject. Looking at the problems, in addition to the problems of vetting, the problems of conflicts of interest, one of the issues that gets into what we were talking about yesterday is de-risking. So we see, for instance, that a large part of de-risking now is tax transparency. And of course, a couple of years ago, the US FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Intelligence Center, issued a Section 311 against St. Kitts. It's Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act, which allows FinCEN to list either a country or a series of transactions or a series of financial institutions as primary money laundering concern. And so FinCEN said the citizenship by investment is a serious money laundering concern. And so this is where, you know, the reputational risk comes into play. There are also regional considerations. So having citizenship in one of the 5 Caribbean, the CARICOM countries allows freedom of movement and also freedom to work without a work permit. And this is also, as a result, been raised at the CARICOM Heads of Government meeting in 2015. They raised it, and I think Kim is going to mention how St. Kitts, with IPSA's help, did a regional program because St. Kitts was a little bit ahead of the other countries in terms of their due diligence. So what about the future? There's a lot of challenges because one of the main needs of people who get these programs is they need easy access to travel. And this is becoming under increasing pressure. So for instance, just in the US in the last year, we've seen a tightening of the restriction on travel. So for instance, last year, Congress passed a law which enables or requires the State Department to not allow what are called seriously delinquent taxpayers to renew their passports, and also gives them the right to revoke passports. Seriously delinquent taxpayer is somebody who owes $100,000 or more. And that includes interest and penalties. So you might only owe $60,000 or $70,000. That puts you in that category. Also, in December of last year, the U.S. passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act, also known as the Visa Waiver Program Involvement Terrorist Travel Prevention Act. So that puts all kinds of requirements on countries that want to continue with visa waiver travel. So for instance, they have to have machine-readable, chip-embedded passports that contain biometric and biographic information. They have to sign the airline passenger notification agreements. And they also have to certify that they put their people through the Interpol and other databases. And then we get to the new administration, the Trump administration. Trump has promised to suspend the issuance of visas to any place where adequate screening cannot occur until proven and effective vetting mechanisms are to be put in place. In addition, he promised to ensure that a biometric entry-exit visa tracking system is fully implemented at all land, air, and seaports. And in view of these, and I won't go into all the other immigration proposals, in view of his proposals, immigration from countries that do not upgrade their screening and cooperation with the U.S. in obtaining and use of biometric entry-exit visa tracking system are going to have difficulty. And then finally, on September 6th, at the G20 Hangzhou Summit, the heads of state communique has all kinds of provisions dealing with denial of entry. For instance, there is a G20 denial of entry experts network, which they committed to reinforcing. In addition, the communique allows China to start a new research center on international cooperation regarding persons sought for corruption and asset recovery in the G20 member states. The G20 did not adopt a proposal like Transparency International that would strictly monitor the so-called golden visa policies by certain jurisdictions, including a number of the G20 countries like Australia, France, the UK, and the US. In the context of the G20 communique, you also see all kinds of tensions between China and, for instance, the United States. So just on November 16, finally the U.S. returned to China Miss Yang, who was one of the top 5 people on the Chinese list of so-called corrupt persons. So in closing, I think there are a number of challenges ahead, the Caribbean and other countries that have these programs are going to have to work hard in order to meet international standards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce. It's really good to just set the scene internationally on the challenges that these schemes face, not just in the Caribbean, but across the world. Our next speaker is going to talk a bit about some of the tools that are open to CBI programs to address some of these international challenges and some of the things that have already been done to strengthen the schemes that are in place. Kim Marsh is the president of IPSA International. He has over 40 years of experience of investigating and working on tackling international financial crime and anti-money laundering. He has specialised on multi-jurisdictional financial and due diligence investigations, as well as anti-money laundering assignments targeting offshore and onshore tax havens, including the Isle of Man, Channel Islands, Switzerland, and various other countries around the world. Prior to joining IPSA, Mr. Marsh completed 25 years with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, retiring as commander of the International Organised Crime Investigative Unit.
Thank you, Chris. I'll start by giving a little bit more history on the programs that exist in the Caribbean. We focused a lot of our work in the early days, especially as a company in the Caribbean. And I think it was 1983 that St. Kitts initiated their citizenship, CBI, Citizenship by Investment program. And it was many years before other countries in the Caribbean and elsewhere around the world decided that this was a way to generate revenues for their jurisdictions. And now there's 5. So the first was St. Kitts, and then Dominique came into play. I think they've been around for 20 plus years was my guess. I don't know the exact year of their program starting. And then in recent years, it was Antigua that came third, St. Lucia and Grenada. Grenada did have a program that they tried to float a few years back, and they ran into issues and they shut it down. So there's 5 in the Caribbean. We hear rumors in the industry that other countries are considering programs, but I would think that they would be concerned about the market being saturated and whether it's really financially viable for them to initiate something. And there are a total of 10 countries now in the world that have CBIs, and that is it's growing not only in this region but elsewhere. We have worked with and currently work with 4 of the Caribbean countries, and we work with 1 in Europe. So in Europe, who's interested, Malta has a well-recognized program that it's set up very similar to what you see in this region, in the Caribbean region. Others, Cyprus, Hungary, Montenegro, a new country that came out of Yugoslavia, has their sights on a program. Very often things are hindered or slowed down because of elections. Montenegro just had an election. Croatia has been playing with the idea for a while. They had an election last year, and it doesn't look like they may have the appetite to pursue this type of initiative. And then there's the residency program. There's lots of those around, and we're going to hear from Dominican Republic, Heidi, about how it works, and they're quite different, as you would expect, than CBI. We first, as a company, got involved in this industry in Canada. I'm Canadian, as you've heard. I'm based out of Vancouver, and Canada has had it's a residency that can evolve into citizenship situation, and the big banks there were putting people through, like RBC, Scotiabank, HSBC. And so I was working with the banks, and there was one bank in particular that was quite progressive in developing compliance. I first went to a conference to provide information on what can be done regarding due diligence in 2006. There was really not much going on the compliance side, and DD before that. And it was about 2010 that I started to get my first introduction into the Caribbean. And I learned some things that were a little bit alarming, such as to do due diligence in China, you need an individual's name in Chinese characters. It's no value of doing research on the English name that they'll adopt when they come out of China. You need it in Chinese characters. You need the Hoku number, a national ID number, and that's the starting point of information to do your research. And the first thing in research is you identify who the individual is. If you haven't 100% identified who the individual is, then your research probably could very well be meaningless. So there were some gaps, definitely, but things have changed rapidly in the Caribbean, and I would say that they're ahead of the pack. In Europe, we have programs such as Malta that are doing very similar compliance and DD as they are in the Caribbean. But there are many countries, and they're in the EU, which is surprising to me, and I've named some of them already, that are just allowing or having the government do the research. Actually, I lived in that world for a while when I was in the RCMP. I was based in London out of the Canadian High Commission, and when the former Soviet Union opened up, I was working with immigration people in Moscow extensively because they had no way of knowing who was who, and they needed assistance. That's just one part of a due diligence that's required. And I'll finish off my opening remarks by saying and describing what is being done in the Caribbean, and in my estimation, we're doing it properly. So we started working with St. Kitts, providing DD services, and then as you heard from Bruce, they got into some problems. FinCEN did an advisory that rocked them a bit. Canada pulled their visa privileges, and that also caused them consternation. There's a lot of petitions that have connections to Canada, whether it's for education or other reasons. And so at that time, I was in London, as I mentioned, in 12 to 14. I met with Prime Minister Douglas. He'd been in place for as Prime Minister for several years at that time, I think 18 years. And what can we do? And so we gave him a bit of a blueprint on what we think needs to be done. And it's not much different than when the regulators beat up financial institutions in the US. What do you need to do to rectify the situation? And so it included a full review of the CIU, the Citizenship by Investment Unit that processes the applicants. So we did a complete review because we knew they had several things that needed to be addressed. That took a few months. And we went in with a small team, and we gave our report with 20 recommendations, and then they had an election, or the change of government. And the new government took them a couple of months, as you would expect, to settle in. They decided to give us approval of the 20 recommendations. So part of what we did was a complete look back. All the files that we could locate, and there was about 5,000. This is all public information. The Prime Minister has spoken about this openly, so I'm not talking inappropriately about client work. And we did a review of the files, a review of type of due diligence that was completed, as well as case management system, job descriptions, the whole gamut. And we finished off that work in mid part of this year, in June of this year. And actually, the person who was leading that team is now heading up the unit in St. Kitts. That program has turned around. I think is very competitive now and conducting proper due diligence along with the rest of it. One of the other initiatives we put forward to the CIUs was to develop a professional association that addressed compliance. So we had in 2015 our first meeting. The units gave us approval as a company to run the association for the first year, and now they have set up a steering committee and they've taken control of this association. That's the first big step. There are two other associations that have been set up in the industry. One is IMC out of Geneva, and the other one is GIIC out of London. IMC seems to have made a lot of progress, and they address all aspects of the industry, not just compliance. In the Caribbean now, they have a 4-step process for screening. They do the in-house, which a lot of law firms, banks, everybody does the basic DD that you can do through WorldCheck and Google, what have you. That's just the initial look. The access through local law enforcement, Interpol checks and other checks that private companies such as IPSA cannot access because we don't have the authority to do that. They share information with governments. In this professional association initiative, we brought in UK, US, Canadian, EU government representatives, as well as we had somebody from the IMF in the first couple of meetings to talk about the economic ramifications with the programs, which has been commented on already by Mr. Edmonds. And the last step, so there's the three that I've mentioned, and the last step is outsourcing to the likes of IPSA. international best practices is not to use just one company such as it. So that was one of our recommendations to the CIUs, is to use more than one, to screen firms such as ours in the proper manner and to score their productivity. The last thing I'd like to comment on is we are now working with again with the Caribbean Association on a training initiative. There needs to be more consistency in the industry on the number of issues, including training of the personnel and the CIUs, training of the service providers. The service providers are the agents that recruit the applicants and put them through. There's a number of other things that need to be done, but we've specifically carved out a training initiative, and we've put a proposal to the association, and we're waiting to hear whether they agree with our recommendations to start training. And we hope to take that global after the Caribbean. Thank you.
Kim, thank you very much. It's very, very interesting insight, and I think the thing that I find fascinating about this is the very clear sort of iterative process that's been in terms of working with some of the countries that have provided the visa waiver schemes to actually make sure that everybody's comfortable with the arrangements. And the way that you've done that with Canada is obviously been productive. Our final speaker today is going to talk to us about the experience of the economic residency program in the Dominican Republic. Her name is Heidi Miranda. She's a senior associate at the Dominican law firm Jimenez Cruz Peña. Ms. Miranda currently practices as a senior associate at Jimenez Cruz Peña, specializing in project finance, foreign investment, energy, immigration, economic regulation, and corporate law. Before joining JCP in 2004, Heidi completed 3 years at the local office of an international law firm, finishing up as an associate in the corporate department. She's currently a member of the legal committee of AmCham and the DR and the National Network for Business, Sport and Environment. She's a Fulbright scholar with degrees from University of Houston and Bookman, one of the top universities in the DR.
Good morning. The Dominican Republic has a different story than other Caribbean nations because we're not part of CARICOM. And given that we're not part of CARICOM, the benefit of having a passport from the Dominican Republic is not as attractive as other CARICOM nations because we're required visas to go basically anywhere. So one of the main attractions to have a new passport that grants you mobility all around the world, you won't get it from the Dominican passport. So how the Dominican Republic has approached the incentive of citizenship by investment is basically by strengthening the areas of investment in the country, and the citizenship by investment or residency by investment is a collateral benefit that comes from investing in the Dominican Republic. The main thing that the Dominican Republic has done is open areas of investment and granting other type of incentives to people to come and invest in the country. Areas that are blooming in the Dominican Republic are free zones, which grant free tax incentives, income and value-added taxes to companies that settle within the Dominican Republic. You also have incentives for companies that settle near the frontier with Haiti, which ensures that that impoverished area will bloom with the economy. Other areas also focus on tourism, which grants incentives to people that want to establish certain tourism projects in the Dominican Republic, that all the construction materials that are brought in are tax exempt, and other tax exemptions for the development. If we're granting all of these tax exemptions, you're thinking, then what's the benefit? The Dominican Republic basically is looking for long-term investments in the country, creating infrastructure, jobs, and therefore making the whole economy more dynamic for investments in the DR. What certain measures that we've taken to control and mitigate some of the things that Kim and Bruce were talking about is that we ratified the Hague Convention. The Hague Convention basically allows the Dominican Republic to verify and validate documents that are presented by people that apply for these programs. And that's one step that we have taken to ensure that the documents that we receive have been validated by the countries that have issued those documents. We've also, in 2011, enacted the ruling for the immigration law. And it's taken a few years, but the immigration programs in the Dominican Republic have been strengthening. And first of all, people used to come to the Dominican Republic and they weren't required any type of documents or visa. They had a valid passport, and even with some countries, you always had to present a tourist card and you would enter into the Dominican Republic without any other requirement. Now, if you're a foreign investor in the Dominican Republic, you need to enter the Dominican Republic with a residency visa or a work visa, which are the ones that allow you to apply for a residency by investment program. But let me go back a little bit. We also have the foreign investment law, which allows you to record your investment in the Dominican Republic. And as soon as you record your investment in the Dominican Republic, you're allowed for this investment program, a residency by investment program. So the first step that you have to take is to obtain a visa from the Dominican government that is in your country of origin or country of last residency. Once you enter the Dominican Republic, you have 60 days to go to the Dominican Agency for Immigration to apply for your residency by investment. And there, the agency verifies with Interpol and other international agencies and validates that the documents that are presented by these individuals, they don't have criminal records outside of the Dominican Republic. Prior to that, when the money's coming into the Dominican Republic, we put in place a lot of anti-money laundering policies in place. And banks need to check every cent that comes into the Dominican Republic. You have to present proof of origin of that money. And also, if it's by virtue of an agreement or a contract that you execute it, you need to present a copy of that agreement to the bank so that the bank may validate the validity of those funds coming into the Dominican Republic. So those are basically steps that we've taken to kind of mitigate some of the concerns that have arisen with other citizenship by investment programs. Given that this investment is not a money that goes directly to the government, but that actually stays with the individual, individuals basically don't apply immediately for citizenship by investment. They're granted their residency by investment, and they can apply for the citizenship by investment for only 6 months. But the tendency right now is not that they are applying for that citizenship by investment immediately. It's something more down the road if they find that they want to live in the Dominican Republic. But the residency by investment programs have been very active and have gained popularity in the last few years. And it's also used as a measure of the government to determine where the investments are really coming from. And the investments that we've seen that are coming from recently, the majority are for Venezuela. And Venezuelans are applying for the citizenship by investment because of the situation in Venezuela. So we've seen an increase of Venezuelan capital coming into the Dominican Republic. And they're investing in all areas of the economy. They're investing in banks, they're investing in insurance, they're investing in services. Big malls in the Dominican Republic are coming from these Venezuelan capitals. A lot of Dominicans, which are not familiar with the legislation, somehow are worried that all these Venezuelans coming in are taking the jobs. But in the Dominican Republic, we have in place a quota that has to be 80-20. 80% of the job positions need to go to Dominicans, and the rest of the 20% can be awarded to any other nationalities. General managers and shareholders of the companies are exempted from that 80-20 provision. So we're taking steps to ensure that capital keeps coming in and the economy keeps developing. Major areas of development now are renewable energy. one law was recently passed where they grant automatic access to a PPA with the Corporation of Electricities, which is publicly owned, whereby if you invest in that area, you're immediately granted the opportunity to negotiate a PPA with the Dominican government. So there are various areas that we're looking for to obtain investments and capture that investment for the long term and not for a particular time in which those want to come into the Dominican Republic. And these programs, as I mentioned, are very popular right now. And some of these measures that we've enacted as a country may be some things that can be looked at by these countries that do have citizenship by investment programs, so that these programs can stay in place for further years without having being targeted by the criticism that comes from the due diligence and from thinking that these are tax havens for this money and these people to come to.
Heidi, thanks so much for sharing with us the Dominican experience, and obviously it's a slightly different size of economy and type of opportunity, and it's fascinating to hear how you've approached those challenges in the Dominican Republic. Conscious we've covered a huge amount of material, and I'm sure there's lots of discussion to have. Before we open up for a more general discussion, I'm conscious there are one or two people who are here representing some of the citizenship by investment programs in the Caribbean, and just thought it would be a good opportunity to ask them if they would like to say a few words about their own program, and if they'd like to respond to any of the points that were discussed in the panel. I believe this is someone here from Antigua and Barbuda. Sorry to put you on the
Good
spot.
morning. Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity. My name is Thomas Anthony. I am the Deputy CEO of the Citizenship by Investment Union in Antigua and Barbuda, essentially the arm of government charged with the responsibility of administering the program. I've been involved for the last 3 years, actually from the inception of the program. No doubt there are challenges involved in managing and executing these programs. However, it is my hope that those who say that the Caribbean country should not be involved are not suggesting that we do not have the capacity to do so. As a matter of fact, and Kim can comment on this later, I believe our background check process is more robust than programs existing in Europe, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So that we are concerned and we acknowledge that individuals who apply for these programs may be using it as an opportunity as a backdoor entry to some of the visa-free countries. And so we address that from an Antigua perspective in our legislation, so that those people who would have been denied a visa for any reason to one of the countries with which we have visa-free access is not eligible for the program. And one may ask, how do we know whether they have been denied? And this is where the background check comes in. Now, apart from the fact that every applicant attached to a file has to present a police report from every country they would have lived in over the last 10 years for more than 6 months, there is a multi-tiered background check process on everyone 12 years and older. And first, the unit will conduct an online check using things like water check and other online resources. We would then send the information to someone like Kim at IPSA or BD or one of the other private due diligence providers. We also send all of the information to the Joint Regional Communications Center operating out of Barbados, which is part of IMPACS. And IMPACS is funded by the US, the UK, European governments, and the governments in the Caribbean. Essentially, the Joint Regional Communications Center would have access to law enforcement information that the private due diligence providers would not, including law enforcement access to Interpol and other global law enforcement organizations. And also partner with our international partners. We not necessarily like to name names, but we do partner with governments and share information and get feedback on these applicants. And it is only after all of these reports come in that we will make a decision as to whether an individual should be approved for citizenship in Antigua and Barbuda. And where, for example, the Joint Regional Communication Center would have come back with a not cleared, for example, for security reasons, it's an automatic denial. Similarly, where our international partner would have come back with derogatory report, it's an automatic denial. And so, in my view, having done this for 3 years, I do not think that individuals who are nefarious characters would necessarily want to apply for these programs because, as I said, your entire life is laid bare over the last 10 years. In any part of the world, you would have been in for more than 6 months. And we continue to work with people like IPSA, the Joint Regional Communication Center, with our international partners to improve the program. But I believe as where we are now, it's a far cry from where these programs were in the 80s and 90s, where they developed a reputation as a silver passport or passport sales programs. It's gone well beyond that. And they are truly investment programs. In the case of Antigua, we have 3 options. Most countries would have 2, where you are making a direct contribution to the government, or you are purchasing approved real estate. We felt that we needed a 3rd option, which is investment in business. And this gives us the opportunity to diversify the economy. And so when Anton spoke about some of the things that should be done with money, I completely agree in that it's important to target certain areas of the economy, and one of those would be the hospitality industry. So, for example, hotel plans to increase the number of hotel rooms on the island, so you can increase airlift, for example. Debt reduction is one of the other areas that we focus on. And infrastructure development is another area, but also diversification of the economy for us is essential. For example, on that front, we have allowed financing of alternative energy to produce 10 megawatts to the national grid, which is financed under the program and has been very successful. We were able to repay that in 18 months of being installed. So these are some of the areas we're looking at. Fostering cottage industries, for example, so that if and when these programs are not as popular as they are currently, we would have done some things in the economy to make the economy more sustainable. Thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Are there any other representatives from any of the other jurisdictions who would like to speak? Perhaps I can ask a sort of opening question, just for discussion. I don't know, Anton, whether you'd be able to answer this or who'd be the best person to ask, really. How does the interplay between freedom of movement within CARICOM interplay with these issues? And if you are granting someone a passport, there's presumably a CARICOM passport that they're getting. How does that work?
Well, I mean, really, there is no free movement of people in the CARICOM.
Only in theory.
Just yet. So that's an issue. We can kick that can down the road a little bit. As to the fact that you have a CARICOM passport and the fact that you have a passport from your country that's a CARICOM one. I mean, if you were to go to a Barbados, for example, just like any other national, you would have to get a work permit. You would have to justify your existence there. So, as to whether a Barbados or a non-participant country or even a participating country is willing to accept you or not, is it a visual check? I mean, this is one of the interesting things. If you have a passport, you have a passport. Let's be clear, there are discriminatory actions already in the region. Some countries not welcoming other Caribbean nations. So it exists. I mean, it is a problem that I think the region is going to have to address. But I think the whole, the free movement of people component of CARICOM is not in existence as yet. So there's still enough checks and balances for any country to go back to a country of origin and ask, exactly who this person is before you allow them to work and operate in that space. And I think ultimately from a regional perspective, there is going to, at some point in time, there is going to have to be that moment where a certain element of, I use the word trust, but a certain element of, well, show me how you're operating the programs. And if indeed countries are embracing and engaging in all of the best practices that have been outlined by the panelists as well as the Reverend Antigua, I think that would pass the initial smell test, I would like to believe.
If I could just comment on that for a minute. We expect that these citizens will be treated like any other citizen of Antigua and Barbuda, for example. But if we narrow the focus on the OECS, because essentially it's an OECS passport that's being issued by each country. Because we have free movement between us, we are focused on, from an association level, standardizing our approach to these programs. Not necessarily the laws, but in terms of the kinds of information that is presented, in terms of the robustness of the background check, and sharing information on demand so that individuals are not allowed to move from one island to the next once they would have been denied. So we understand between the OECS there is that free movement, and so therefore it's important that all of us look at these applicants in the same way.
Very interesting.
Well, one observation is that most of the applicants are very high worth individuals, and a lot of them are have a background where they are highly skilled. So in most cases, they would have no problem needing the ability to move from country to country. So for instance, Barbados has an economic residency program. It gets a ton of investors from other CARICOM countries, in part because of the quality of life in Barbados and schools. People that are doing business in, say, Guyana or Trinidad, they want to be in Barbados anyway, and so they take advantage of the economic residency program that's there. So I don't see that the fact that CARICOM hasn't fully embraced the freedom of movement as a major problem for the applicants.
Make a comment about two things. I think the steps that the 5 Caribbean nations that have CBIs, the steps that they've taken to ensure the integrity of the process is extremely important, because they do get questioned by the other members of CARICOM because of this access to the area. Where I'm surprised there isn't more due diligences in Europe, because you have Schengen, and there's 27 member countries in Schengen, and that some of them are not totally in, but it gives you access to Europe. And if you have the likes of Malta who are doing good due diligence, and there's huge pressure put on them, all of these things become political issues, and there's lots of dialogue before you see the programs getting initiated. But in Europe, you have access to the whole continent, and some of the countries are doing very little. They're doing what I described that Canada was doing in the 90s, where the called me in as the Mountie from the embassy, High Commission in London, can you do a background? Which is, as described by Thomas, one component of what you really need.
Yeah, one other observation is that one of the things that's driving the market is that a lot of professionals are already spending a lot of their time on the road. And all they really need is a computer to work. So I've had clients that, for instance, have explored the Bahamian economic residency just to avoid New Orleans municipal tax. And, so that's another example of, why some of these programs are of interest.
Yeah, I saw a number of hands, so perhaps we can take 2 or 3 points.
I have a question. Tim, I'm Canadian as well, so I think you were referring to Canada's program, was the immigrant investor program, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that worked up to a certain point, but then it also had some failings, I guess, to a certain degree. But I think my word of caution based on the Canadian experience is that you don't get a concentration in certain industries. Like in Canada, I think one of the things we found, basically with Scotiabank, Toronto region, was a huge concentration of restaurants and proliferation of financing of restaurants that would be open for not a very long time. So there's caution around there. But my question with respect to CBI, and unfortunately I've been out of the Caribbean and surrounding the Caribbean and Scotia, is how many of these have special tax treatment? Is that the reason that these wealthy investors are seeking residency? Because that opens up a whole different discussion with respect to the G20 wanting to focus on tax avoidance and tax evasion. And that could also impact de-risking to a certain point. So how do we reconcile that as well?
I think that's a really interesting area for us to get into, and I'd also be interested in any comments on any issues around beneficial ownership and any sort of masking of identity that might be, you might seek to use this as a route to.
Well, there are a number of people, as I said, that are looking for CBI or economic residency for tax purposes. And as long as they comply with the provisions of the country from where they're coming. So for instance, Canada has a mark-to-market tax when you leave. The US has adopted a similar anti-tax expatriation where they require somebody who's expatriating to file IRS Form 8854, which certifies under the penalties of perjury that you complied with the last 5 years of your income tax. So as long as those steps have been taken, there's not a problem. So, presumably the CBI programs would want to also get some certification that the applicant would be in compliance with their the tax requirements of the country from where they're coming. I mean, that's one of the results of the U.S. effort against Swiss banks, is that in 2009, once UBS did its settlement with the U.S., they did a new due diligence program, and actually FINMA, the Swiss financial regulator, required that of all Swiss banks, that they would certify that their foreign clients were in compliance with foreign laws, because the FINMA wanted to strengthen the integrity of the Swiss financial community. So I would think that this would be, a requirement of the CBI countries.
If I could just comment on that.
Yeah, of course.
Most of the countries, if not all, do not have tax on global income, inheritance, or capital gains. However, just getting citizenship is not sufficient to benefit from these areas. One would have to establish residency, and residency, number of days of residency is different in each island. So just by getting the citizenship, as was alluded to earlier, does not mean that you do not need tax in your home country.
Well, I mean, an interesting point is the way that some of the programs work. For instance, Barbados Economic Residency Program requires you to spend a certain amount of time in Barbados, but you also have to remit to Barbados a minimum threshold of money from which you pay tax. And that enables the applicant or the resident to then become a Barbados tax domiciliary, so that if, for instance, the UK or the country from which that person is coming, has a problem, the applicant can show that he or she is now a resident of Barbados and is paying, the tax due.
Joanna Francevich, I'm with the U.S. Embassy in Bridgetown, and we follow the developments in the programs as closely as we can. And one of the things that we really do applaud is the creation of an association to try and bring all of these programs into constant dialogue. Something that I wanted to ask Kim, however, is how much, and perhaps others who are in the know, is how much investment is being invested into the CIUs, the units. We have 5 programs in the region. They are not all created equal. How much is being invested into things like moving to biometrics, into ensuring that the checks are consistent across the board? I know there has recently been conversation, and St. Kitts has said they want to bring their program and make it a platinum standard, perhaps something that the Europeans can follow. But how much of the funds that are coming in are also being invested into ensuring capacity, increasing the staffing, because you've got quite a lot of applicants that have to be vetted, and increasing technology so that some of this information exchange can happen more freely and quickly?
From our vantage point, it differs in every country. Not saying that simply because Thomas is in the room, but Antigua did it properly. They started out using international best standards, and they followed that. And I think they are working on a case management system that they all need, that they will need eventually. And St. Kitts has moved that along. Some countries go through hardships. Dominica was hit hard by a hurricane recently, and so they just need money for infrastructure reasons. I've been told that they're going to invest more into the unit and raise their standards in different ways. I think from what I see generally is that the new ones in the industry are doing it properly with the right personnel and the right compliance standards. And as I said, everyone is slightly different on how much they're putting into the units, but it's like any government organization. You want more space, you want more people. I mean, I worked for the government for 25 years, and it's never enough, right? But I think there's an understanding by the governments, prime ministers, that these are important to their economy, and consequently they get proper consideration. There is a need for one country comes to mind that needs to shore up more, but you can't say more than that.
And because I'm also new to the region, I have one more question. One of the things that I found observing this is I'm not exactly sure where the buck stops. There are, if an application is denied, I understand there are review mechanisms, but is there legislation in place that prevents an arbitrary decision by heads of government to overlook whatever may be presented and issue or agree to citizenship regardless of that? I mean, is there a check and a balance?
Thomas,
That's a great question. Yeah, it's the elephant right in the room.
I like the question actually, because Antigua's program, I believe, is the most transparent in that in legislation we are required to report to Parliament twice every month. And this is not just from an operational perspective, but in terms of our income and expenditure. And there are the most recent report was June of this year. We will see all of the expenses. But if I go back to the first question, the funding aspect, Antigua and Barbuda is one that ensures that the unit is independent of government from a funding perspective. In that there are two amounts that are paid by each applicant: the investment amount, and then there is what is called a processing fee. On average, adults would pay about $50,000, and minors would pay about $25,000. And that processing fee goes into an operational account, which is controlled by the unit. So we are able to meet all of our expenses before then passing funds on to the government. I know that in some of the other models, the funds go directly to government, and then there's funding provided for the unit. So we have some independence where that is concerned. Yeah. And then in terms of whether or not there's legislation which prevents arbitrary decisions, in the legislation in Antigua, there is, I believe, Section 12, which allows for review, so that if an individual is denied, they can then write to what is called to the Prime Minister to ask for a review to be done. And once he determines that there should be a review, he would then constitute a review panel who would look at the facts. The unit would have representation in the position of the CEO, and the decision is made and a recommendation made to the Prime Minister. Operationally, what happens is all of the approvals are internal to the unit, so that the CEO or the Deputy CEO will make a determination whether an applicant is approved. Where there is a file we think should be denied, a recommendation is sent to the Prime Minister, who is the minister responsible for the program. If he concurs, then it's a matter of going through the review process if the applicant so desires. If he does not agree, it would then go back to that review panel for some decision. So in that sense, it mitigates against these arbitrary decisions.
I think it'd be interesting to focus a bit more on how to drive the capital flows that are created from this programme into the real economy in Ireland, and also look at how they can drive job creation. And perhaps I'd ask Heidi just to talk a bit more about how that's worked in the Dominican Republic. I know that's been a particular focus of the scheme there.
Well, as I said earlier, what we've tried to do is focus on creating laws that provide incentives for different areas of the economy. And basically, through those different incentive laws, we are able to diversify the funds coming into the Dominican Republic. And that has been how we viewed that this flow can actually reach different areas of the economy and be sustainable through the years. For example, in free zones, we have a lot of call centers now, and we're focused on services. And we would be calling for U.S., and a representative from the Dominican Republic is actually the one serving St. We are also, for example, for airlines. Free zones are establishing airports are free zones, and airlines that are coming in, all the work that is done to airplanes or for the caterers of the food that is it's sold to the airlines and grant services. It's all done in a free zone capacity that creates a number of jobs, and all these airlines and companies that provide these services for the airlines, their incentive is they're tax-free. They don't pay income tax or they don't pay a value-added tax, which maximizes their benefits. When you record your investment, you also get through this center that we made. We have a center for investments in the Dominican Republic, and this center basically its job is to go throughout the world and promote the Dominican Republic and promote different areas of investment. And we've seen there's an increase in telecommunications, for example. Also, tourism with the incentives law. We also have what has been this incentive law in tourism. Basically, it's more for development areas in the country, and you've got buildings which are sold to individuals, so that it's all over the world. And the main incentive is that the construction materials that are brought in, and it's tax-free. And the person that buys a unit, the first 10 years of the purchase of that unit is free of property tax. So we've developed different ideas to spread out the distribution of the economy.
So those incentive rules obviously make Dominican Republic a more attractive place to invest in. But are there any specific advantages that you derive from having economic residency in relation to those laws? I mean, if I'm as a foreign direct investor coming into DR, presumably I can still take advantage of those opportunities. I don't need to be a Dominican national to take advantage of those.
No. Foreign nationals and foreign and nationals have the same rights and obligations in the Dominican Republic in terms of investment. There's not a minimum quota for foreigners to invest or to have a national partner. It's really open.
Okay.
It's really open, and that's one of the things that was all, because there were restrictions, but as of 1995, those restrictions were eliminated.
I mean, is there any sort of agreed best practice now in terms of these programs, in terms of what derives the best benefit to the country? I mean, I know in the UK that at the moment there's a discussion about restructuring our own equivalent scheme so that investors need to actually, at the moment I think they need to buy a certain amount of gilts, treasury bonds, but then they can sell them, and actually the UK has got very little out of it. So there's talk about changing that scheme so that they do need to put some kind of contribution into a fund or a scheme. Is there a sort of best practice approach now that's agreed? I don't know whether any panelists could comment on this from Antigua.
I mean, if I could, I think the front end, in terms of the management of the programs and the best practices, I think that, no offense to anybody else, that should really where the focus has to be in terms of the management. On the back end, in terms of where the money goes. As to whether the government wants to set up a fund, for infrastructure. I mean, clearly, let's go with the assumption here that the money is going to be spent properly. And let's go with the assumption that somebody isn't going to squander the money to another location, and we find that they have their own citizenship that they bought from somewhere else in Europe that's not really doing the program properly. And I think the positive on the front end is really and truly the association. On the front end is realizing that there are best practices that have to be put in place. I think where the competition may very well be is whether countries are going to look at residency programs and combining them with citizenship programs, creating a hybrid which sort of broadens the pool a little bit. Whether countries are going to take advantage of the fact that maybe there's going to be a decline decline in the numbers of people who are interested in this, and maybe the time is to double down now to pay off the debt or to invest in. And I think the race is going to be, I think, truly for smaller economies, is to see how much can get done now as it relates to the current financial situation the countries are in, recognizing that 5-10 years from now, the programs may be in a different spot. So we're going to see a race. Yeah, hopefully it's not a race to the bottom in terms of people outbidding each other or lowering the standards. But I think there's going to be a race and competition in terms of which country realizes I have a particular need and is going to practice a good governance in terms of using that revenue for the good of the country. So 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I think when we look at debt, when we look at investment in infrastructure, and when we tie it back to these programs, is going to be sort of the real sort of story as to who won and who lost in terms of this program.
As far as standards, I mentioned the IMC of Geneva. They're leading the industry on a number of issues, and I think it's important for all of them to have a standard process for operating if you're a new country coming into this industry. And generally across the board, there's no regulation right now really, and they want to make it self-regulated and take control of their destiny. And I think that this is a critical time for changes such as this. And there's competition in the industry, which is sometimes not that healthy. And I'm not saying the country so much; it's the others that are the other players. And hopefully that works itself through so that the best comes out of it for any country that wants to participate in the industry.
On this specific issue of returning investment to investors, I think we have to separate the two programs. For residency programs, it may be appropriate because these individuals move to the country, they set up business, they create jobs, and there's increased tax revenue from their activity. But in the case of citizenship and investment programs, there is no requirement to move to the country. In my view, it should never be a refund of investment from a government perspective. If you want to have a return on your investment, then you can choose the real estate or the investment investment. But I think it's a contribution to the government on the CIPs or CDIs as some call it. It should never be a return of investment. Otherwise, what is the benefit to the country?
I'm conscious we're coming to the end of our time allotted, and I was instructed by CCAA that we have to have a hard stop at 12:15 because apparently the military don't like to be kept waiting to go to Santa Claus. I've got one last question I thought would be interesting to discuss, but are there any other questions people would like to raise from the floor?
I have more of an academic question. I heard more than once reputational risk and more than once unintended consequence. But it is not clear in my mind what we're talking about. The reputational risk to the country, to the institutions.
I mean, to give you an example, the government changed twice in Belize because in the 80s there was an abusive program. The people in Belize saw there were tons of Chinese living there. There were also reports that people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were basically selling the passports outside of the program. So that was a problem. Reputational loss has been, for instance, when Canada has told Grenada or Dominica that, look, no more visa-free entry, because we see that, the people that are coming coming in as your citizens, you know, are basically, again, Chinese that have only been in your country for a couple of months.
Or not been at all.
Yeah, or not been at all. And so, I mean, or when you get on the Section 311 primary money laundering list, that's not good for your, you know, reputation as a financial center or even as a country. So, you know, all of these things, I mean, there have been, you know, issues about Saudi Arabian having diplomatic passport in order to be immune from his divorce. And all of those create, you know, issues.
That's outside of the program. Let's be clear.
Yes, I want to be clear that the diplomatic passports are not issued on the program.
Yeah, but one of the problems that St. Kitts had was that an Iranian named Alzira Magadan came in. I mean, he had a diplomatic passport for Azerbaijan and another country, and tried to enter Canada supposedly to meet with the Prime Minister, and Canadians blew the whistle. And again, that was a, you know, reputational.
But that's a foreign, I mean, that's
He had a
a
petition.
diplomatic passport
Yeah.
versus, you know, an investment passport, if you want to make that distinction. It still has had a lot of unintended consequences for St. Kitts, but that again is more of a question of legislative and proper procedure and ministries of finance, not ministries of foreign affairs, in terms of who gets issued a diplomatic visa, rather than investment.
Okay, final question. What political rights does the Citizenship by Investment passport give you? Does it give you the right to vote? And if so, are you storing up interesting problems for the future?
You do have a right to vote, but in the Antiguan month, you have to reside in the city for at least a month prior to election and establish residency in that constituency in order to vote. So if they meet that requirement, then yes, they can vote. But you cannot remain where you live outside of Antigua and cast a vote.
Okay, well, I think we've hit the 12:15 mark, so I shall bring this panel to a close. Thank you very much to all our participants in the discussion, and particularly to our panelists. I think giving us a really great insight into the programme and some of the challenges that